Hey everyone, this is a piece from the Ideas of Leon Trotsky, edited by Hillel Ticktin and Michael Cox. It's titled The Myth of the, quote, Super-Industrialiser, Trotsky's Economic Policies in the 1920s. Footnote. This article first appeared under the title Leon Trotsky and the Problems of the Smitchka and Forced Collectivization, published in Critique, 1981. During the debates of the 1920s, the left opposition... Did I say end footnote? End footnote. During the debates of the 1920s, the left opposition within the Bolshevik Party never seriously considered the possibility of forced collectivization. In January 1934, Yevgeny Preobrazhensky confessed to the 17th Party Congress that this had been his greatest error. Quote, "In this question," end quote, Preobrazhensky declared, quote, "what was needed was the greater farsightedness of Comrade Stalin, his great courage in the formulation of new tasks, the greatest hardness in carrying them out, the deepest understanding of the epoch and of the relationship of class forces," end quote. Preobrazhensky, cited in Alec Nova's An Economic History of the USSR. When the preliminary attack on the Kulak began in the winter of 1927-28, Leon Trotsky dismissed it as having no lasting significance. The, quote, centrists, Trotsky was certain, were merely undertaking a factional maneuver in the form of a, quote, left zigzag. 1 year later, quote, Spolochnaya Kollektivizatsiya was underway. Even now, Trotsky believed that no lasting change of policy was in the offing. The, quote, elimination of the kulak as a class, end quote, was an absurd slogan, for Soviet Russia did not possess the agricultural machinery required to consolidate land holdings and work land holdings collectively. The most he expected from the ultra-left course was a proliferation of, quote, bogus kolkhozy, end quote, or bogus collective farms, which would continue to be dominated by kulaks. In Trotsky's judgment, the organizational transformation of Soviet agriculture logically presupposed a vast expansion of socialist industry. In the meantime, the party's responsibility was to preserve the smitchka, or the alliance between worker and peasant, by increasing the availability of manufactured consumer goods within the context of the new economic policy. As early as 1923, Trotsky had expressed the desire to overcome the new economic policy and replace the new economic policy with consistent economic planning. The transcendence of the new economic policy, however, presupposed that the town would create the industrial preconditions. A study of Trotsky's views on Soviet agriculture must therefore begin with a clear statement to the effect that the opposition's principal concern was not to reorganize agriculture, but to avoid the impending collapse of the smitchka. The manner in which different party leaders reacted to the growing crisis in grain procurement was determined by their understanding of the smitchka and the smitchka's problems. Bukharin believed that the marketed surplus of grain had declined chiefly due to the breaking up of the large estates and their replacement by scattered small-scale holdings. Before the First World War, the landed estates had been responsible for more than 20% of grain marketings, the kulaks for 50%, and medium and small peasants for the remainder. There was no doubt that an increase by about 50% in the number of individual households made an important contribution to the displacement of market-oriented agriculture by subsistence agriculture. To Bukharin it seemed that the way to restore the pre-war pattern of grain sales was to give the kulak greater opportunities to lease land, hire labor, and expand the scale of production. Stalin agreed with Bukharin that the pattern of land holdings was the basic problem. The sale of grain was, in Stalin's view, restricted because the peasants were eating more than before the revolution. Having emancipated themselves from the landlords, the small and middle peasants had, quote, obtained the opportunity of considerably improving their material conditions, end quote. Footnote. See Joseph Stalin's Problems of Leninism, page 251. End footnote. It was this agreement on the source of the problem which led both Stalin and Bukharin to seek a solution in the reorganization of tenor. In Bukharin's case, the proposed solution envisaged an expansion of output. In Stalin's case, it relied upon both a larger output and the suppression of rural living standards. Sorry, I was seeing if there's problems of any descriptions of problems of Leninism on the internet. In his own assessment of agriculture, Trotsky shared Stalin's opinion that the change of tenor had affected a redistribution of income, freeing the peasants of many of the taxes and rent payments which before the war had squeezed the grain onto the market. Footnote. See Trotsky's Towards Socialism or Capitalism. Like Bukharin, Trotsky pointed to the, quote, liquidation of landlordism, end quote, as one of the factors accounting for the decline in the marketed surplus. But unlike both Stalin and Bukharin, Trotsky considered this to be a, quote, secondary problem, in contrast with the, quote, goods famine, or the shortage of manufactured consumer goods required to provide the peasant with an incentive for commercial agriculture. I'm looking up goods famine, Soviet Union. Oh, no. I'm not seeing anything for it. Back to the text. The goods famine resulted from the change in the pattern of land holdings and the disappearance of fiscal pressures previously exerted upon the peasant. By 1925 to 26, gross agricultural production regained the pre-war level, and total industrial output, including both census and small-scale industry, had reached 90%. This joint approximation to pre-war conditions did not ensure adequate incentives to agriculture, because the peasant, now exercising greater control over the peasant's produce, was less willing to part with it. Although these circumstances appeared to be conducive to a change in the terms of trade favoring agriculture, in fact, the, quote, price scissors, end quote, or the relation between the industrial and agricultural price indices, turned against the peasant. This development was due initially to the slower recovery of industry, and later to an acceleration of inflationary investments in new construction and heavy industry. In the cities, direct government intervention held the prices of manufactured goods in check, thus stimulating purchases by a growing urban population. The result in the countryside was accentuated scarcity and dramatic increases in the market prices of industrial goods, the difference between the officially suppressed wholesale prices and market prices constituting the profit of the private merchant. A greater ability on the part of the peasant to withhold his produce from the market, together with a diminished encouragement to sell, these two factors culminated in the, quote, grain strike of 1927 to 28. I'm going to look that up. Grain strike, 1927 to 28. I'm going to read the Wikipedia for this. Soviet grain procurement crisis of 1928 is the Wikipedia article title. The Soviet grain procurement crisis of 1928, sometimes referred to as the, quote, crisis of the NEP, was a pivotal economic event which took place in the Soviet Union beginning in January 1928, during which the quantities of wheat, rye, and other cereal crops made available for purchase by the state fell to levels regarded by planners as inadequate to support the needs of the country's urban population. Failure of the state to make a successful use of the price system to generate sufficient grain sales was met with a regimen of increasingly harsh administrative sanctions against the Soviet peasantry. The state of national emergency which followed led to the termination of the new economic policy and spurred a move towards the collectivization of agriculture in 1929. The Russian Revolution of November 1917 ushered in a period of civil war and economic dislocation, in which the ruling all-Union Communist Party Bolsheviks made use of forced grain requisitions, trading to the peasantry currency with little purchasing power for an underdeveloped consumer goods market. Viewed by most Soviet contemporaries as a temporary wartime expedient, the system of, quote, war communism was extremely unpopular with Russia's grain-producing peasantry and the cause of a massive wave of unrest and revolts that threatened to fatally destabilize the government. The force-based system of war communism was abandoned in the spring of 1921 with the adoption of the so-called new economic policy, under which a stable gold-based currency was restored and a return made to the market system. Instead of forced requisitions of all marketable surpluses, a food tax, in Russian that's called a prodnalog, was implemented, which necessitated peasant households providing a limited portion of their production to the state, after which households would be free to sell its remaining surplus not needed for household survival on the open market. By 1924, this system of prodnalog, or food tax, had been replaced by a money tax, with Soviet state grain requisitions accomplished by buying and selling. Although the return to the market system in agriculture was ideologically problematic for many Bolsheviks, the years from 1922 to 1926 were successful in practical terms, with total agricultural production by the peasant-based economy fully returning to pre-revolutionary levels. Production of cereal grains approximated pre-war figures, potato production greatly exceeded such figures, and livestock populations, gravely affected during the war, returned to normalcy for pigs and sheep, while the count of horses was slowly and steadily restored. The period of war communism saw Soviet cities largely depopulated when former peasants returned en masse to their native villages amidst the ongoing economic collapse. This trend was reversed under the new economic policy, and industrial facilities were restored and restarted, approaching the pre-war levels of output during the second half of the 1920s. Further growth of the economy and improvement of living conditions, it was felt by Soviet planners, would require new investment in factory facilities and capital goods. With access to world capital markets severely restricted to the revolutionary Soviet regime, these funds that would need to be generated by the state either through a loosening of the backing of the gold currency, a raising in the level of taxation of the largely rural population, or some combination of these factors. Communist Party penetration of the countryside remained weak, amounting to an average of one rural communist for every 6 village Soviets, a mere 0.52% of the rural population versus 0.78% of the total population in 1927. Moreover, these rural communists who took leading roles in village Soviets and cooperatives included a disproportionate number of comparatively well-to-do peasants, a social group, party and non-party which dominated local administration. The persistent strength of so-called, quote, kulaks in the Soviet countryside further contributed to the dissatisfaction with the economic status quo on the part of many members of the largely urban Communist Party. From the end of 1926, demand among planners and party activists for a new program of mass industrialization that would modernize the largely peasant country. It's not as complete, that's a weird sentence. Although the new economic policy was seen at the time as a permanent structure throughout 1927, the 15th Congress of the VKPB, held in Moscow in December 1927, acceded to this sentiment, approving a new program for the industrialization of the USSR, an acceleration which would ultimately prove incompatible with a small peasantry freely exchanging a comparatively small fraction of its production in the marketplace. Collectivization of agriculture was held by the communists to be the essential corollary of any successful industrial campaign, it being faithfully maintained that a collective organization would eliminate the inefficiencies inherent in capitalist agriculture, thereby expanding production and making a greater quantity of grain available to the state for conversion to capital goods. Throughout the early years of the Russian Revolution, the peasantry faced a shortage of basic farm and household items, including agricultural implements, construction material, cloth, and finished consumer goods. This marked a continuation of the wartime situation, in which industrial production had been moved from a consumer orientation to fulfillment of the military needs of the state in the war against the German Empire. The Bolshevik regime had never been able to catch up with pent-up demand, and state and cooperative supplies remained spotty, while the prices demanded by private traders remained high. A so-called scissors crisis had developed in the early years of the new economic policy, as prices of consumer goods escalated while market prices of agricultural products fell. Early in 1927, the Communist Party decided to address the disparity by lowering the selling prices of industrial goods by approximately 10%. Although this pricing decision was meant to undercut the high prices charged by private traders, in practice it only exacerbated the miserable supply situation as goods were snapped up from the market, leaving the inventories of state supply agents barren. Those goods which were available tended to be committed to larger towns located along railway lines rather than to smaller villages deep in the countryside. The net result of this situation was a goods famine that provided an inadequate incentive for peasants to participate in grain sales to state grain purchasing agents who had little or practical value to offer the peasantry in exchange. The Soviet economic year between October 1st to September 30th, 1925-26, had generated state grain procurement of 8.4 million tons. This was far exceeded in 1926-27, when a post-revolutionary record harvest of 76.8 million tons resulted in a state procurement of 10.6 million tons at stable prices. No upward price adjustment had been necessary owing to the massive size of the harvest, which resulted in a supply glut. Expectations for the coming year were raised accordingly, with planned procurement for the coming economic year, 1927-28, exceeding quantities obtained during the previous year of record harvest. In addition to planned establishment of a new grain reserve of 819,000 tons, economic planners sought increased quantities of grain for export to the European market as a means of generating the foreign currency needed for purchase of capital goods from abroad. Calls for an official policy of centrally planned industrialization had emanated from the left opposition headed by Leon Trotsky throughout the middle of the 1920s, with an explicit criticism levied in a September 1927 program of a, quote, frank and open drift to the right, end quote, to accommodation with the most wealthy segment of the peasantry to the detriment of national industrialization and further development of a socialist economy. This demand was easy to ignore when grain was readily available to the state on the market and unused factory capacity remained to be restarted. However, late in 1927, the pervasive optimism associated with the boom period of the new economic policy began to dissipate. A severe slump in state grain collections began in October 1927, following the new harvest of wheat and rye. This trend continued in November and December, with planned total procurements for the quarter of 7 million tons missed by a massive 2.1 million tons. This quantity was not only sufficient for creation of the planned grain reserve and the meeting of export targets, but was viewed by planners as insufficient for the feeding of the nation's cities and the members of the Red Army. Reasons for the decline set off a fierce debate in the ranks of the VKPB. Sorry, that's the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. Party leader Joseph Stalin depicted the shortfall as political in nature, the result of, quote, sabotage by the rich peasantry in an effort to force the state to raise grain procurement prices. This Stalin likened to blackmail, forcing the state to abandon the state's industrialization plans in favor of filling their own pockets with proceeds of sales to the market. Stalin's joint leader of the party during previous years, Nikolai Bukharin, regarded this perspective as a, quote, fairy tale, instead arguing that rather than hoarding and speculation, the cause of grain supply difficulties was a poor harvest, combined with insufficiently attractive procurement prices that deterred sales to state grain collectors. The crisis in grain collections caused a split of the top leadership of the Communist Party, with a majority of party activists rallying around Stalin, who had now begun vigorously espousing the virtues of rapid industrialization, previously associated with Trotsky and the left opposition. Only a minority supported Bukharin in his call for a continued social peace between the state and the peasantry, and his criticism of those who would, quote, neglect a sense of moderation, to skip over necessary stages, end quote, on the slow and measured path to industrial development. Stalin and the rapid industrializers retained effective control over the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, controlling 6 of 9 seats of the party's political bureau, which handled matters of day-to-day governance, with Bukharin able to muster the support of Alexei Rykov and Mikhail Tomsky in favor of a moderate pace of industrialization and social peace. Behind the scenes, Stalin organized diligently, obliquely criticizing moderates in speeches to groups of party activists, and with his new right-hand man, Vyacheslav Molotov, maintaining effective control over the official party daily newspaper, Pravda, and efforts being made to take over editorial control of the party's monthly theoretical magazine, Bolshevik. Okay, so thank you for letting me read that. There is no doubt that Bukharin was aware of the implications of the price scissors and was largely responsible for official efforts to suppress industrial prices by lowering costs of production and accelerating the turnover of industrial capital. Bukharin hoped that the spread of cooperative retail merchandising would curtail the activities of private traders so that the benefits of lower retail prices would reach the peasants. What he did not anticipate was the growing momentum of heavy industrial investments after 1925, which contributed to shortages in the villages and ruptured the smitchka. And the smitchka, for those who don't know, according to Wikipedia, smitchka was a popular political term in Soviet Russia and Soviet Union. Smitchka can be roughly translated as, quote, collaboration in society, quote, union, quote, alliance, quote, joining the ranks. The generic meaning of the noun, derived from the verb something in Russian, these are just Russian words, something like in the Russian spelling too, so I don't even know, can't even begin to tell you what they're saying, is joining of two things, contact, joint, linkage, coupling, like joining the two opposite branches of a railroad whose construction was started from both ends. The best known example of the usage of the term was the motto in the Soviet politics of Smitchka of the city and the village, and was understood as the alliance of the proletariat and poor peasantry. Back to the text. In principle, Bukharin opposed such investments, preferring instead to use existing industrial capital more extensively. For that reason, Bukharin was viewed by Trotsky and the left opposition as an opponent of socialist industry. In turn, Bukharin looked upon the proposal of some members of the opposition to finance industrial expansion by raising wholesale prices as a recipe for plundering the peasant. My intention in this chapter will be to show that Trotsky and Bukharin in reality pursued a common objective, the preservation of the smitchka. Bukharin misunderstood Trotsky's position, considering Trotsky's position to be, quote, super-industrialist and a threat to the peasant. Trotsky was no less critical of Bukharin's views. On the one hand, Bukharin endorsed the theory of, quote, socialism in one country, implying industrial self-sufficiency. On the other hand, Bukharin resisted new industrial development. Bukharin's failure to overcome this inconsistency, together with his, quote, cooperative plan for agriculture, caused Trotsky to regard Bukharin's position as that of a neo-Narodnik literateur, who understood neither Marxism nor elementary economics. I'm going to read the Wikipedia for Socialism in One Country. Socialism in One Country was a Soviet state policy to strengthen socialism within the country rather than socialism globally. Given the defeats of 1927 to 1923 of European communist revolutions, Joseph Stalin encouraged the theory of the possibility of constructing socialism in the Soviet Union alone. The theory was eventually adopted as Soviet state policy. As a political theory, its exponents argue that it contradicts neither world revolution nor world communism. The theory opposes Leon Trotsky's theory of permanent revolution and the communist left's theory of world revolution. Initially, all leading Soviet figures, including Stalin, agreed that the success of world socialism was a precondition for the survival of the Soviet Union. Stalin expressed this view in his pamphlet, Foundations of Leninism. However, he would later change this position in December 1924 during the succession struggle against Trotsky and the left opposition. Socialism in one country was criticized by Trotsky and Grigory Zinoviev as antithetical to Marxist principles, while the theoretical framework was supported by Nikolai Bukharin. Excuse me, that's disgusting. I have a cold. The defeat of several proletarian revolutions in countries like Germany and Hungary ended Bolsheviks' hopes for an imminent world revolution and prompted them to focus on developing socialism in the Soviet Union alone, as advocated by Joseph Stalin. In the first edition of the Foundations of Leninism, published in 1924, Stalin was still a follower of the orthodox Marxist idea that revolution in one country is insufficient. Vladimir Lenin died in January 1924, and by the end of that year, in the second edition of the book, Stalin's position started to turn around as he claimed that, quote, the proletariat can and must build the socialist society in one country, end quote. In April 1925, Nikolai Bukharin elaborated the issue in his brochure, Can We Build Socialism in One Country in the Absence of the Victory of the West European Proletariat? And the Soviet Union adopted socialism in one country as state policy after Stalin's January 1926 article on the issues of Leninism. 1925 to 1926 signaled a shift in the immediate activity of the Communist International from world revolution towards the defense of the Soviet state. This period was known up to 1928 as the second period, mirroring the shift in the Soviet Union from war communism to the new economic policy. In his 1915 article on the slogan for a United States of Europe, Lenin maintained that proletarian victory would be uneven and arrive through individual capitalist nations' conversion to socialism. Lenin further elaborated that the working class must implement socialism nationally where they can without waiting on a coordinated international unison of revolutions. Grigory Zinoviev and Leon Trotsky vigorously criticized the theory of socialism in one country. In particular, Trotskyists often claimed and still claim that socialism in one country opposed both the basic tenets of Marxism and Lenin's particular beliefs. That the final success of socialism in one country depends upon the revolution's degree of success in proletarian revolutions in the more advanced countries of Western Europe. Notably, they cited Lenin's words at the March 1918 Seventh Congress, where Lenin had argued that the success of the Soviet Revolution inextricably depended on the success of socialist revolutions in other countries. In this address, Lenin had emphasized being realistic and pragmatic, cautioning against wishful thinking that would place too much faith in the immediate success of a world revolution. Friedrich Engels, when answering the question, will it be possible for the revolution to take place in one country alone, end quote, strongly argued in the negative, basing his argument upon the economic and historic importance of the world market, claiming that the world market had, quote, already brought all the peoples of the earth, into such close relation with one another that none is independent of what happens to the others, end quote. The defeat of all the 1917 to 1923 revolutions in Europe, except Russia, ended the Bolsheviks and especially Lenin's hopes for an imminent world revolution. Lenin expressed this, stating he was not expecting a predefined state for other nations to achieve the same revolution in his 1918 letter to the American workers. With the proletarian revolutions in other countries having been either crushed or altogether failed to materialize, the nascent Soviet Union found itself encircled by capitalist or pre-capitalist states. According to the interpretation of Lenin's writings by the exponents of socialism in one country, Lenin laid down a long-term future course of action for the nascent Soviet state and its vanguard, the Russian Communist Party, prioritizing strengthening the nascent Soviet state internally so as to ensure its survival. The plan was based on, firstly, building a close alliance between the proletariat and the vast masses of the small peasantry, with assured proletarian leadership of the peasantry, and secondly, constructing a complete socialist society in Russia, whilst patiently awaiting and aiding the worldwide class struggle to mature into a world revolution in order to hasten the final victory of socialism. In his pamphlet, The Impending Catastrophe and How to Combat It, Lenin argued that Russia had to overtake advanced countries in economic output as well as political advancement. In Lenin's speech delivered at the plenum, in Stalin's speech delivered at the plenum of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, Stalin observed that the aforementioned was written by Lenin as early as September 1917, on the eve of the October Revolution, during the imperialist war. Opponents of this interpretation, notably Leon Trotsky, have contended that the Lenin quotes adduced in support of socialism in one country are taken out of context. They argue that in the 1915 article on the slogan for a United States of Europe, the expression, quote, triumph of socialism, possible, in a single country, in a single capitalist country, end quote, in context, refers only to the initial establishment of a proletarian political and economic regime, and not to the eventual construction of a complete socialist society, which would take generations. As for the quote from 1923 article on cooperation, Trotsky maintains that the passage speaking of, quote, necessary and sufficient, end quote, prerequisites for the transition to socialism, is concerned only with the, quote, social organization, end quote, and political prerequisites, but not with the, quote, material productive, end quote, and cultural ones which Russia still lacked. Historian Isaac Deutscher, in his biographical account of Stalin, noted that Marxist theoreticians in the 1920s took a condescending view of Stalin's formulations and doctrine of, quote, socialism in one country. Deutscher recounted a party meeting in which David Ryazanov, Soviet historian and founder of the Marx-Engels Institute, derided Stalin with the words, quote, stop it, Koba, don't make a fool of yourself. Everybody knows that theory is not exactly your field, end quote. According to political scientist Barak Knai-Paz, Trotsky's theory of permanent revolution was grossly misrepresented by Stalin as defeatist and adventurous in antithesis into his proposed, quote, socialism in one country policy to secure victory during the succession struggle. Knai-Paz argued that Trotsky encouraged revolutions in Europe, but was not at any time proposing, quote, reckless confrontations with the capitalist world. Stalin presented the theory of socialism in one country as a further development of Leninism based on Lenin's aforementioned quotations. In Stalin's 14th of February 1938 article titled Response to Comrade Ivanov, formulated as an answer to a question of a, quote, Comrade Ivanov, mailed to Pravda newspaper, Stalin splits the question in two parts. The first side of the question is in terms of the internal relations within the Soviet Union, whether it is possible to construct the socialist society by defeating the local bourgeoisie and fostering the union of workers and peasants. Stalin quotes Lenin that, quote, we have all that is necessary for the building of a complete socialist society, end quote, and claims that the socialist society has for the most part been indeed constructed. The second side of the question is in terms of its external relations and whether the victory of socialism is, quote, final, i.e. whether capitalism cannot possibly be restored. Here Stalin cites Lenin that the final victory is possible only on the international scale and only with the help of the workers of other countries. Marxist historian Isaac Deutscher traces Stalin's socialism in one country policy to the publication of The Foundations of Leninism, which emphasized the policy of isolationism and economic development in opposition to Trotsky's policy of permanent revolution. In a 1936 interview with journalist Roy W. Howard, Stalin articulated his rejection of exporting the revolution and stated that, quote, we never had such plans and intentions, end quote, and that, quote, export of revolution is nonsense, end quote. The slogan was parodied in the novel Moscow 2042, where communism in one city was built. Back to the text. Trotsky's understanding of the Smichka was rooted in Marxist dialectics. Socialist industry and private agriculture were viewed as a dialectical unity of opposites. Within this relationship, there was unity between the proletariat and the poor and middle peasants, and opposition between these two groups and the kulak. The transcendence of the contradiction between industry and agriculture would require the industrialization of agriculture. As Trotsky wrote in 1927, quote, The industrialization of agriculture means the elimination of the present fundamental contradiction between town and country, and so between peasant and worker, as regards their role in the country's economy, their living conditions, their cultural level. They must come closer together as the frontier between them disappears. A society in which mechanized cultivation forms an equal part of the planned economy, in which the town has absorbed into itself the advantages of the country, spaciousness, greenery, while the country has been enriched with the advantage of the town, paved roads, electric light, piped water supply, drains. That is to say, where the antithesis of town and country has itself disappeared, where the peasant and the worker have been transformed into participants of equal worth and equal rights in a single production process, such a society will be a genuine socialist society. End quote. Trotsky, 1927. Trotsky consistently stressed that the material basis for production was the chief determinant of class relations. Until the material basis of rural production was transformed, Trotsky believed that class differentiation was inevitable. Bukharin, in contrast, tended to think of overcoming the rural-urban contradiction by restoring the flow of goods between the two sectors of the economy, and by encouraging small-scale rural industry, for example, food processing. When he urged the peasants to, quote, enrich themselves in 1925, Bukharin did so in the hope that further differentiation might be avoided. Cooperative organizations, Bukharin believed, would permit the peasantry as a whole to, quote, grow into socialism through the mechanism of trade and finance. Organizing the production and marketing of agricultural products, the cooperatives were to become the, quote, mediating link between town and country. According to the cooperative plan, not even kulak cooperation would represent a threat to socialism. If the kulaks accumulated capital, the kulaks would invest their savings in Soviet financial institutions or in new equipment. In the first instance, such resources might be transferred in order to finance cooperation among bedniaks and seredniaks. In the second, they would serve to extend the market for industry and accelerate the turnover of capital. In either case, the institutional context of agriculture would guarantee that the kulak's ambition would be harnessed in the interest of socialism. From Trotsky's standpoint, Bukharin appeared to be fetishizing an organizational form and ignoring its content. Socialist agriculture would not be created by, quote, organizational credit and state administrative methods, end quote, but by mechanization, tractorization, and electrification. The mere organization of primitive agriculture within a cooperative framework would alter neither the reality of class divisions nor their objective cause, that is, the inability of state industry to provide more advanced equipment. By ascribing an implicitly socialist character to cooperatives in general, Bukharin seemed to be restoring the Narodnik vision of pre-capitalist rural community, yet to be disintegrated by capitalist relations of ownership and production. On these grounds, Trotsky concluded that Bukharin was the author of both a kulak deviation and Soviet Narodnichestvo. For the same reasons, Trotsky was skeptical of the, quote, ultra-left position taken by Yuri Larin. Never heard of this person. For the same reason, Trotsky was skeptical of the, quote, ultra-left position taken by Yuri Larin and others who went to the opposite extreme and proposed collectivization of the Bedniak together with a general offensive against private capital. Yuri Larin Yuri Loren lived from 1882 to 1932 and was a Soviet economist and politician. Born into a middle-class intellectual Jewish family, Yuri Loren was brought up in Crimea by his mother, Frederica Granat, sister of Ignati Granat, one of the founders of the Granat Encyclopedic Dictionary and other members of the Granat family. She had contracted scarlet fever while she was pregnant, which is the probable cause of the muscular dystrophy which Loren contracted at the age of 9, which left him partly crippled for life. His father, Shnoyer Zalman Lurie, was an engineer, Hebrew author, and Zionist. He abandoned his wife while she was pregnant and ill, and later divorced her. Loren joined the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party in Simferopol in 1900. Loren moved to Odessa and organized a student Marxist group, but was arrested and sent back to Crimea. There he resumed his revolutionary activity and was arrested in 1903 and sentenced to 8 years exile in Yakutia. Loren escaped in 1904, but because of the difficulty he had walking, he was carried in a laundry basket by others involved in the escape. Loren emigrated to Geneva and, following the split in the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, joined the Mensheviks. Loren took his revolutionary pseudonym Loren from a character in Eugene Onegin by Pushkin. Yuri Loren returned to Russia early in the 1905 revolution, was arrested, but escaped to Ukraine, where he tried to reunite the two halves of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. Arrested again, he escaped to Baku before emigrating to Germany. Loren's wife Lena was a Menshevik from 1907. Loren was arrested. Loren's wife Lena was a Menshevik from 1907. Loren's wife was arrested in 1911 and held in Butyrka prison. At their marriage ceremony, another Menshevik, Lydia Don, acted as Loren's godmother in the, quote, incongruous baptism, undertaken in a czarist prison so that he could have an orthodox marriage, entitling him to take his bride into exile. In 1914, the couple adopted Lena's orphaned niece, Anna Lorena. In 1910, Loren wrote a series of articles arguing that Russia was progressing towards becoming a capitalist society in which an elected Duma would become increasingly powerful, and that it would not be necessary to repeat the revolutionary violence of 1905. This is angrily refuted by Vladimir Lenin, the Bolshevik leader, who described Loren as the, quote, enfant terrible of opportunism. After the outbreak of war in 1914, Loren was deported from Germany and settled in Stockholm. In 1915, Loren wrote a series of articles for the Moscow daily Russkaya Vedomostiya about the German war economy, which Loren said, quote, has given the world a pattern of the centralized direction of the national economy as a single machine, end quote. After the February Revolution in 1917, Loren returned to Russia and was one of the first eminent Mensheviks to switch to the Bolsheviks. After the Bolsheviks had seized power on the 7th of November, Loren was appointed head of the Legislation Bureau in the new government. But Loren resigned on the 17th of November and protested the failure to form a coalition with other socialist parties. In December 1917, in recognition of his knowledge of the German war economy, Loren was appointed a founding member of the Supreme Soviet of the National Economy, the Senkha. Loren drafted the decree in March 1918, which laid out the management structure of nationalized industries. He was also the author of imaginative schemes for opening trade relations with the U.S., electrification of Petrograd's factories, developing the Kuznetsk coal industry, and irrigating Turkestan to grow cotton. Some of these ideas were developed later but dismissed as impractical under conditions prevailing during the Russian Civil War. Delivering his political report to the 11th Party Congress of the Russian Communist Party in March 1922, Lenin remarked, quote, Loren is a very capable man and has a vivid imagination, Imagination is a very valuable asset. But Comrade Loren, has little too much of it. I would say, for example, that if Comrade Lenin's stock of imagination were divided equally among all the members of the Russian Communist Party, there would be very good results. But until we can perform this operation, Comrade Lenin must be kept away from state administrative planning and economic affairs. End quote. Lenin. In 1902, Lenin was seconded to the newly opened Soviet embassy in London, where the ambassador Leonid Krasin was urged by Lenin to keep him in London, quote, as long as possible, end quote, take care of his health, and give a, quote, long literary job, end quote, to do. Given a, quote, long literary job, end quote, to do. Quote, if you take any of his statistics on trust, end quote, Lenin added, quote, we'll sack you, end quote. Lenin returned to Russia in 1923 and worked as a writer and economist. During the split in the Communist Party that followed Lenin's death, Lenin was an outspoken critic of Leon Trotsky and the left opposition, who, Lenin claimed, had little or no support from industrial workers. But in some respects, Lenin was, quote, more, quote, left than the left opposition on agrarian and national issues. Lenin proposed that all kulaks should be disenfranchised and rural taxes increased by 20%. He also was an abstinent critic of alleged discrimination of Russians in the Ukrainian Soviet Republic. Lenin was one of the few leading Bolsheviks who showed an interest in Jewish questions, though people from Jewish backgrounds were overrepresented among the old Bolsheviks. For many, a sense of internationalism often overrode any particular association with Jewish identity or community in their political work. As head of OZET, the Society for Settling Toiling Jews on the Land, Lenin supported the creation of Jewish agricultural settlements in Crimea, which were tolerated in the 1920s but later suppressed. An area of Crimea with Jewish settlements was named Lerendorf after him. In 1931, Lenin criticized the decision to create the Jewish autonomous area of Birobidzhan as unrealistic, for which he was severely censored. In May 1924, speaking at the Congress of Soviets, Lenin proposed that to increase industrial output, normal weekends should be abolished and replaced by a quote, continuous work week, end quote, in which workers would have every fifth day off, but in shifts, so there was never a day when the factories were not fully operating. The experiment was launched across the Soviet Union in 1929, but abandoned in 1940. Arthur Ransome, working as a correspondent for the Manchester Guardian, met Lenin in 1920 and was impressed by his, quote, obstinacy, his hatred of compromise, and a sort of mixed originality and perverseness, and the real heroism with which he conquered physical handicaps, end quote. Menshevik Simon Liberman described Lenin as, quote, he was a very tall man with regular features, large black eyes, and a little pointed beard. He had been crippled by infantile paralysis, now had difficulty in moving his legs and left arm, and his chest was sunken in and his shoulders protruded sharply forward. I could feel tension in every step he took. Lenin flourished in 1918 and 1919, during the era of passionate enthusiasm for a complete overhauling of Russian economy. But Lenin's star did not shine for long. The contrast between Lenin's fantasies and life's realities was working against Lenin. End quote. Lenin died in Moscow on the 14th of January 1932, aged 49. Lenin's body was cremated and ashes were buried at the Kremlin wall. Lenin's widow, Lena Larina, was arrested during the Great Purge in 1938 and spent 17 years in prison and exile. Lena Larina's health was broken by the experience, and she was mostly bedridden from her rehabilitation in 1955 until her death in 1973. Back to the text. Past experience indicated that communes were prone to ignore the division of labor, to strive for self-sufficiency, and to end by consuming their own capital. Poor peasant collectives were fated by an extreme contradiction between advanced social forms and the most backward methods of farming. At best, they were an organizational, quote, laboratory and a model for the future. But according to Trotsky, quote, the main work in preparation for the future is of a more fundamental nature. It involves the development of industrial work which will give to the countryside the technical basis for the industrialization of agriculture, end quote. Trotsky. Footnote. See Trotsky's Towards Socialism or Capitalism. End footnote. In the belief that agricultural reorganization was a distant prospect, Trotsky concentrated his attention on the more immediate dilemma posed by the price scissors and the goods famine. In the autumn of 1925, retail prices of industrial commodities were more than 50% above agricultural procurement prices, calculating the two indices in terms of 1913 prices. Naum Jasny recounts that, quote, in the Ukraine and Crimea in October 1926, textiles retailed at 172% above the 1913 price. In private trade, there were 225% above pre-war, while producers of farm products were getting a scant 20% in excess of pre-war prices for their produce. Hence the quote, scissors, with reference to textiles, was equivalent to more than 200 against the Ukrainian peasant, end quote. Jasny, The Socialized Agriculture of the USSR. It looks like Naum Jasny was an economist who specialized in the Soviet Union, who lived from 1883 to 1967. I'm going to see if I can look up this book. I'm not seeing any descriptions of this book. I'm not seeing anything on Google Books. So, anyway, back to the text and footnote. In consequence of these disproportionate prices, grain acreage recovered more slowly than gross agricultural production. By 1926 to 27, agricultural output exceeded the pre-war level by 6%, but per capita consumption of food grains, even in the rural areas, was below 1913 standards. Part of the problem was the shortage of the draft animals. However, the major disincentive was with respect to grain procurement was to be found in the scissors. As Jasny observed, quote, the critical impediment to recovery in its later stages, was the unfavorable price relationship between farm and non-farm products. Production for the market, rarely repaid the costs, end quote. Jasny, The Socialized Agriculture of the USSR. Throughout 1925, Trotsky repeatedly warned that unless the requirements of the villages were satisfied, the peasant would create his own smitchka with foreign capital in the form of contraband. To determine the pressure of foreign goods, Trotsky proposed to develop a system of comparative coefficients which would compare the efficiency of Soviet production in terms of price and quality with that of other countries. These coefficients would then serve as a guide both to the import plan and new investments. Domestic production would be rationalized and standardized in order to lengthen runs and reduce costs. In the meantime, he urged that, quote, commodity intervention, end quote, be undertaken in those cases where the coefficient was least satisfactory. Inexpensive foreign goods were to be sold in the Soviet market, the profits being used to subsidize retail prices of the corresponding domestic commodity. See my Leon Trotsky and the Politics of Economic Isolation, published in 1973. And the description of Leon Trotsky and the Politics of Economic Isolation says, a highly original and controversial examination of events in Russia from 1917 to 1927, in which Professor Day challenges both the standard Trotskyite and Stalinist interpretations of the period. At the same time, he rejected the traditional emphasis on Trotsky's concept of permanent revolution and argues that a Marxist theorist is essential. Professor Day concentrates upon the economic implications of revolutionary Russia's isolation from Europe, how to build socialism in a backward, war-ravaged society without aid from the West. This problem lay behind many of the most important political conflicts of Soviet Russia's formative years. The chapters of that book, Leon Trotsky and the Politics of Economic Isolation, include the dilemma of economic isolation, the myth of Trotskyism, isolation and the mobilization of labor, integrationism and the new economic policy, the po- the po- the politics of economic isolation, the search for a new faith, socialism in one country, Trotsky's alternative, Trotsky's attack on socialism in a quote, separate country, integrationism and defeat and exile. Okay, back to the text and footnote. The proposal for commodity intervention was designed to provide a short-run solution to the scissors. Trotsky's longer-run intention was to use the grain thus brought to market in order to finance the import of new industrial equipment. In contrast with Stalin's vision of Soviet self-sufficiency, Trotsky proposed to stabilize the Smichka by drawing upon the, quote, reserves of the world market. Trotsky summarized the relationship between closing the scissors, the renewal and expansion of fixed capital, and the growth of international trade in the following comment, quote, our economic system has become part of the world system. This has made new links in the chain of exchange. Peasant grain is exchanged for foreign gold. Gold is exchanged for machinery, implements, and other requisite articles of consumption for town and village. Textile machinery acquired for gold and paid for by the export of grain provides new equipment for the textile industry, and thus lowers the price of fabric sent to the rural districts. The circle becomes very complicated, but the basis remains the same, a certain economic relation between town and village. End quote. Trotsky, towards socialism or capitalism. Trotsky's overriding concern to provide the peasant with adequate incentives set Trotsky apart from both Bukharin and Preobrazhensky. Preoccupied with the, quote, cooperative plan, Bukharin suspected that the, quote, super-industrializers were bent upon accumulating industrial capital by exacting, quote, tribute from agrarian, quote, colonies. Preobrazhensky confirmed this suspicion by urging that, quote, primitive socialist accumulation take place behind the protective barrier of the trade monopoly by means of deliberately manipulating the terms of domestic trade to the disadvantage of agriculture. Although Trotsky shared Preobrazhensky's commitment to industrial expansion, Trotsky did not agree with his arbitrary notion of pricing, of which his understanding of the relation between light and heavy industry, or with his understanding of the relation between light and heavy industry. I'm going to look up primitive socialist accumulation, actually. Wikipedia says primitive socialist accumulation, sometimes referred to as the socialist accumulation, was a concept put forth in the early Soviet Union during the period of the new economic policy. It was developed as a counterpart to the process of primitive accumulation of capital that took place in the early stages and development of capitalist economies. Because the Soviet economy was underdeveloped and largely agrarian in nature, the Soviet Union would have to be the agent of primitive capital accumulation to rapidly develop the country. The concept was proposed originally as a means to industrialize the Russian economy through extracting surplus from the peasantry to finance the industrial sector. The major proponent of this concept was Yevgeny Preobrazhensky in his 1926 work, The New Economics, which was based in his 1924 lecture in the Communist Academy, titled The Fundamental Law of Socialist Accumulation. The concept was proposed during the period of the new economic policy. Primitive socialist accumulation's main principle is that the state sector or economy of the transitional period was to appropriate the peasant's surplus product to accumulate resources necessary for the growth of the industry. To this end, the major mechanisms were the foreign trade monopoly held by the state and price control in favor of industry, which in effect caused price scissors. This theory was criticized politically and associated with Leon Trotsky and the left opposition, but it was in fact put into practice by Joseph Stalin in the 1930s, as when Stalin said in his speech to the captains of industry that the Soviet Union had to accomplish in a decade what England had taken centuries to do in terms of economic development in order to be prepared for an invasion from the West. Ernest Mandel, Marxist economist, challenged the view that Stalin implemented the policies of Trotsky with the same methods, as he stated, quote, Stalin is said to have put Trotsky's program into practice even with a brutality Trotsky himself would not have approved, end quote. Mandel further elaborated that the economic program advocated by Trotsky and the left opposition, quote, undoubtedly underwent many changes in the period 1923 to 35, end quote. Mandel also argued that the policies of the left opposition are distinguishable from the proposals of the united opposition of 1926 to 27, and the alternative strategies developed by Trotsky in his later works such as The Revolution Betrayed and The Transitional Program. Beyond publications and policy debates, the application of the primitive socialist accumulation theory affected the working class as well, as more surplus was extracted from them for industrial capital investment. Real wages for both regular workers and managers plummeted despite the growing wage differential. Piecework production relations were introduced wholesale. Soviet penal policy was tightened, causing a significant growth of inmates in the Gulag. It was not until after Stalin's death that a minimum wage was introduced. Reductions to piecework production relations were made, and mass rehabilitations resulted in dissolution of most of the Gulag. Back to the text. Trotsky was convinced that the world division of labor and international trade were expressions of technological progress and the steady rise in the organic composition of capital. The replacement of living labor power by a constantly growing volume of fixed capital meant that large-scale industry could only remain competitive by increasing the volume of sales in the service of the world market. The fixed capital requirements of modern industry were so great that no country could afford to become self-sufficient or deny itself the advantages of trade. Preobrazhensky looked at the problem of industrialization in a more restrictive context. Quote, as we know, end quote, Preobrazhensky wrote in The New Economics, quote, the development of the productive forces and the development of technology led as a general rule to an increase in the organic composition of capital, which means an ever-increasing importance of production of means of production. The possibility of extending the production of consumer goods and cheapening them is achieved by a relatively still greater extension of production of means of production, end quote. Preobrazhensky. Given the assumption of a more or less self-contained economy, Preobrazhensky's reasoning could not be refuted. Stalin acknowledged this fact in 1928 when Stalin likened the price scissors to, quote, tribute. Trotsky sought to avoid the dilemma posed by Preobrazhensky by husbanding scarce capital and drawing instead on the capital equipment available in the world market. The concern to restrain the demand of heavy industry upon the country's limited resources was apparent in Trotsky's writings from the early months of 1925. In January of that year, Felix Dzerzhinsky, in his capacity as Vysenka chairman, received a major commitment from the Central Committee to expand metallurgical output in anticipation of new capital construction. This was the first program for heavy industrial expansion to receive the explicit sanction of the party leader, the party leaders, period. Pyatakov, another of Trotsky's associates and deputy chairman of the Vysenka, enthusiastically welcomed Dzerzhinsky's proposals. Wikipedia says, the Supreme Soviet of the National Economy, Superior Soviet of the People's Economy, abbreviated as sometimes as BCHX and VSNKH, was the superior state institution for management of the economy of the of the RSFSR and later of the Soviet Union. There were two institutions with this name at different times from 1917 to 1932 and 1963 to 65. The VSNKH of the first period was the supreme organ of the management of the economy, mainly of industry. The VSNKH was launched on December 5th, 1917, through a decree of the Council of People's Commissars, Sovnarkom, and All-Russian Central Executive Committee of Soviets of the Russian Socialist Federative Soviet Republic. Its stated purpose was to, quote, plan for the organization of the economic life of the country and the financial resources of the government, end quote. It was subordinated to the Sovnarkom. The recently established All-Russian Council for Workers' Control was dissolved into the new organization. It had rights of confiscation and expropriation. The first chairman was Valerian Osinsky, and with Bukharin, Georgy Apakov or Lomov, Milyutin, Sokolnikov, and Vasily Schmidt also appointed to the council. After the creation of the Soviet Union in 1923, it was transformed into the joint All-Union Republican People's Commissariat. In 1932, it was reorganized into three People's Commissariats of heavy industry, light industry, and forestry. In each of the Union Republics of the Soviet Union, subordinate organizations existed. These were referred to as BCHX, followed by their Union Republic acronym. For example, BCHX, Belarus, for the Belarusian SSR. The All-Union Council could be referred to as the BCHX-CCCP. The Republican VSNKHs had control over small-scale minor industries which used local materials and supplied local markets, which were referred to as, quote, enterprises of Republican subordination, end quote. Large-scale industrial enterprises, quote, enterprises of Union subordination, end quote, were controlled by one of the industrial sector departments of the All-Union VSNKH. Within the VSNKH, departments were split into two types. Functional sector departments. Departments within the functional sector dealt with decisions relating to finance, planning, economic policy, and research and development. And the industrial sector departments. Departments of this type were created by decree of 1926 and consisted of chief departments known as glavki. Heads of all the departments in this sector formed the Council of the All-Union VSNKH together with representatives from the Union Republics. Heads of the VSNKH include Valerian Osinsky from 1917 to 1918, Alexei Rykov from 1918 to 1920, Felix Dzerzhinsky from 1924 to 1926, Valerian Kubishev, 1926 to 1930, and Sergo Ordzhonikidze, who lived from 1930 to 1932. Vysenka was reestablished by Nikita Khrushchev when he introduced decentralization of the management of industry by means of Sovnarkozes. It was subordinated to the Council of Ministers of the USSR and managed industry and construction. Sovnarkozes were introduced by Nikita Khrushchev in July 1957 in an attempt to combat the centralization and departmentalism of ministries. The USSR was initially divided into 105 economic regions, with Sovnarkozes being operational and planning management. Simultaneously, a large number of ministries were shut down. Back to the text. Trotsky was quick to communicate his personal misgivings. Trotsky's account of the incident follows, quote, "Returning from the Caucasus in May 1925, I found a typical picture of speculation. All the trusts were following a course of capital investments. The operations of the Prom Bank were ceaselessly expanding. In July, I wrote to Dzerzhinsky and Pyatakov with a warning that this fever was fatally leading to a financial and industrial crisis. Neither Dzerzhinsky nor Pyatakov understood this, and they accused me instead, especially Pyatakov, of an intervention against industrialization. I showed them that the overall material base, with a proper policy, could be considerably expanded, but that with the given material base it was impossible to push industrialization forward with the aid of unreal credits. Probably everyone recalls that in September 1925, a serious crisis occurred, accompanied by the dismissal of workers, etc." End quote. Trotsky. According to Wikipedia, Prom Bank was the shorthand name for a series of significant institutions within the Soviet banking system between 1922 and 1959, when Prom Bank was merged with Selkaj Bank, Agricultural Bank, and Tsesegom Bank, Residential Construction Bank, to form the Construction Bank of the USSR, or Stroy Bank. The Russian Trade and Industrial Bank was established on the 1st of September 1922 under the new economic policy. On the 7th of December 1922, another specialized bank was established as Electrocredit, a joint stock company. On the 13th of August 1924, the former was renamed the Trade and Industrial Bank of the USSR, and on the 29th of October 1924, later was reorganized as the Bank for the Electrification of the USSR, or Electrobank. On the 27th of June 1928, Prom Bank absorbed Electrobank and became the Industry and Electrification Long-Term Credit Bank of the USSR, still known as Prom Bank. In 1932, it was again renamed as the Finance Bank of Capital, Construction and Industry, Transport, Posts, and Telegraphs. The Prom Bank was initially led by Alexander Krasnochiakov from the 24th of April 1922 to the 18th of September 1923, then by Vladimir Kassandrov from the 12th of October 1923 to the 13th of March 1927. Back to the text. In all, Trotsky wrote 3 letters to Dzerzhinsky, each time stressing the same theme as appeared in his criticism of Bukharin's, quote, cooperative plan. Socialist construction could not be guaranteed by, quote, organizational credit and state administrative methods, end quote. 3 years later, Bukharin's Notes of an Economist were there with their reference to the problem of the gestation period and, quote, bricks of the future, end quote, would prove reminiscent of Trotsky's, quote, unreal credits. Repudiating the autarkic implications of socialism in one country, Trotsky insisted that Soviet Russia's dependence upon foreign suppliers of industrial equipment was materially embodied in her existing plant. In order to acquire access to inexpensive foreign equipment, he was even prepared for a time at least to contemplate the expansion of kulak agriculture. In June 1925, he declared that it would be a, quote, reactionary policy to interfere prematurely with the development of rural productive forces which are currently growing in capitalist or semi-capitalist forms. On another occasion, he claimed that concessions to the kulak, assuming the growth of state industry continued without interruption, would not pose the threat of, quote, economic surprises or of a, quote, sharp turn to capitalism, end quote. Trotsky, towards socialism or capitalism. Quote, there may be periods, end quote, he added, when, quote, the state, sure of its economic power and desirous of increasing the rate of development, purposely allows a temporary increase in the weight of private enterprise in agriculture in the shape of capitalist farms, ... end quote. In November 1925, Trotsky compared the initiative of the kulak with the complacency of Bedniak communes, which I think is like poor peasants' communes, and approved the Central Committee's decision to ease restrictions on land leases and the hiring of agricultural labor. The wager on the kulak, he suggested, should be treated as, quote, purely a matter of expediency, end quote. At a time when Zinoviev was attacking Bukharin for, quote, degeneration, quote, retreat, and the promotion of, quote, state capitalism, Trotsky avoided identification with the Leningraders and awaited the harvest. 1 second. Okay. Sorry about that. By January 1926, in E.H. Carr's words, quote, the kulak had shown himself master of the situation, end quote. During the previous year, agricultural taxes had been lowered. The inflation caused by the, quote, unreal credits rekindled distrust of the ruble, and the peasant, whenever possible, paid his taxes in cash rather than bringing the grain to market. Shortages and rising prices followed an excellent harvest. The export plan had to be suspended. Trotsky judged the time to be appropriate for an appeal to the party leaders for a reconsideration of priorities. In a speech on the 19th of January 1926, Trotsky described the smichka as a, quote, endless ribbon of cloth which is stretched out between town and country. A cloth conveyor, that is what the smichka is, end quote. Trotsky. At precisely the time when the textile smichka needed to be supplemented gradually by a tractor smichka, the conveyor between town and country had broken down. The volume of textiles sent to the villages during the harvest had proven to be inadequate. When the Central Committee met in plenary session in April 1926, he suggested a 5-year plan aimed at overcoming the goods famine by 1931, more progressive agricultural taxes, selective increases in wholesale prices, combined with an effort to lower retail prices, commodity intervention for 1926 to 27, and expanded capital commitments to industry. At the same time, Kamenev took the view that industry was now lagging behind agriculture. This congruence of opinion prepared the way for the formulation of the joint opposition. From the beginning, Trotsky's alliance with Kamenev and Zinoviev was fraught with tensions, the most serious of which concerned the issue of industrial pricing policy. Preobrazhensky, Pyatakov, Smirnov, and several others of Trotsky's associates were of the opinion that wholesale prices should be raised in order to capture a portion of the profit going to the netman. The proposal was sensible. Higher wholesale prices in the cities might have diverted a larger portion of the output to the countryside, where retail prices are already as high as the market would bear, and wholesale price increase would have been difficult to pass on to consumers. Trotsky sympathized with the proposal but was wary of its possible implications. Trotsky feared that any increase at the retail level would intensify pressures on the trade monopoly and worsen the crisis. Ultimately, he believed that industrial prices could only be lowered by renovating fixed capital and expanding production. According to Smirnov, Zinoviev exerted pressure on Trotsky to abandon the proposal for higher wholesale prices. Early in 1927, Trotsky complied, provoking the frustration of Smirnov and the Democratic Centralists and the first breach in the joint opposition. The policies of the party leadership helped to exacerbate these tensions. The, quote, regime of economy, end quote, a rigorous campaign to suppress wages and lower the costs of production, had the effect, or appeared to have the effect, of reducing retail prices. In fact, the situation was much more complex. The main reason for the modest decline in retail prices in the autumn of 1926 was a reduction in peasant demand. A portion of the redundant purchasing power had been absorbed by tax increases, and grain prices or rural incomes were curtailed by a more orderly procurement campaign. Thus, poor peasants were obliged to postpone purchases, while the higher income groups became more selective. The trust had deliberately avoided producing those commodities whose prices were most strictly controlled. Because these were the commodities which normally met with the heaviest demand in the villages, the production profile adjustment to the, quote, regime of economy, end quote, in a perverse manner, the goods most in demand became relatively more scarce, while inventories of others actually began to grow. Appearances were so deceptive that some observers concluded the goods famine was about to be replaced by a, quote, new sales crisis, end quote. The misleading signals coming from the marketplace boded ill for the political prospects of the opposition. In 1927, the party leaders renewed the campaign to lower retail prices by means of intensified administrative pressure. In the meantime, increasing resources were channeled into heavy industry, where they made no immediate contributions to resolving the goods famine. In the year 1926 to 27, Heavy Industry, Department 1, received 71% of industrial investment and increased its outputs by 26.8%. The output of Light Industry, Department 2, increased by 14.9%. Footnote: see R. Davies and Carr's book, Foundations of a Planned Economy, Volume 1. Not seeing any descriptions for this book. Sorry, that's what I was looking for. Back to the text. Where am I? Because urban incomes continued to grow, the effect of the retail price controls was actually to increase effective demand in the cities and further impede the flow of goods to the peasants. Alec Nova quotes one Soviet writer who described the situation this way, quote, "Towns are closer to the sources of industrial goods. The villages are further away. Therefore, the towns appear to obtain a larger share of industrial goods than they would have obtained at prices which balance supply and demand. The policy of low prices not only failed to lower prices for the village, but on the contrary, it lowered prices for the towns at the cost of raising them for the village, and by large percentages too." End quote. Alec Nova. Throughout this period, the opposition leaders argued that the peasants, and especially the poor peasants, were the main victims of party policy. Apart from the need to deal with the goods famine, they concentrated their attention on the promotion of, quote, class cooperatives, with the aid of a, quote, class credit system. They insisted that a preponderant share of the modest resources being committed to agriculture should go to the bidnyak and serednyak, not to the kulak, who was frequently availing himself of state credits to form fake machine societies and bogus cooperatives. Criticizing the, quote, cooperative plan, they maintained that Bukharin's policies had merely contributed to the furtherance of class differentiation. When the harvest of 1927 brought with it the, quote, grain strike, it was none other than Bukharin who found himself obliged to announce a reinforced offensive against the kulak. Trotsky, now about to be expelled from the party, treated the announcement as empty posturing. Quote, "Today it is, quote, enrich yourself, and tomorrow it is, quote, dekulak yourself. To Bukharin such things are simple. Pick up the pen and it is done. From Bukharin one can expect nothing better. But the kulak is not given to such about turns. The kulak will yet have his say." End quote. Convinced that the balance of class forces had shifted decisively, Trotsky was taken completely unawares when Stalin responded to the crisis with the introduction of the, quote, Siberian method. Wikipedia says the Ural-Siberian method was an extraordinary approach launched in the Soviet Union for the collection of grain from the countryside. The Ural-Siberian method was introduced in the Urals in Siberia, hence the name. The Ural-Siberian method was a return to the drastic policies that had characterized war communism in the period prior to Lenin's new economic policy. Criticized by the right opposition for being a restoration of extraordinary measures, the Ural-Siberian method was approved and eventually received legislative support in June 1929. Between 1928 and 1929, various suggestions were put forth to increase the efficiency of grain procurement. The initial version of the Ural-Siberian method was first suggested by Ural Obkom and the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, based on the actual practice used there in 1928. The Bolshevik Politburo approved the suggestion on the 20th of March 1929 and recommended its use in eastern regions of the Soviet Union. Siberian Raikom significantly contributed to this approach. Particularly, it suggested piatic kratka, see below, and therefore at the April 1928 plenum of Central Committee and Central Control Committee of the CPSU, Joseph Stalin dubbed the method, quote, Ural-Siberian. The approach resembled that of the Kombeds, Poor Peasants Committees, of 1918 to 1919. The village assemblies endorsed the grain procurement plans for their villages and set up the commissions which assigned individual quotas according to the, quote, class approach. It was supposed that kulaks, rich peasants, would be forced to deliver their surplus grain. Kulaks who failed to meet their quotas were fined the amount up to 5 times the quota. The fine, colloquially known as piat kratka, 5-timer. Further refusal resulted in up to 1 year in forced labor camps, and in the case of group resistance, up to 2 years of confinement with confiscation of property and subsequent internal exile. This practice anticipated the policy of, quote, dekulakization. The Ural-Siberian method fostered increasing unrest among peasants, with a corresponding intensification of repressive measures, both in the countryside against peasants and in cities against private grain traders declared profiteers. In 1929 witnessed a significant increase of, quote, mass disturbances and, quote, kulak terror. In November 1929, OGPU reported 12,808 arrests of counter-revolutionary charges and 15,536 arrests on economic charges, with the bulk of arrests in major grain production regions: Siberia, Northern Caucasus, Ukraine, Central Black Earth region, and the Urals. These drastic measures allowed Stalin to speak of, quote, satisfactory procurement, with the backdrop of the 1927 crisis, which resulted from the scissors crisis of the mid-1920s. Some readers believe that this relative success convinced Stalin of the efficiency of a forced administration approach to the peasantry, further developed in the policy of total collectivization in the USSR. The policy was declared an immediate priority at the November 1929 plenum of the Central Committee of the Russian Communist Party. In Soviet historiography, it was claimed that the method was introduced upon the initiative of the Zavyilovo village in Novosibirsk Okrug, and the term Zavyilovo method was in use for some time. On the 22nd of March 1929, the newspaper Soviet Siberia informed about the, quote, Zavyilovo initiative and called for spreading it to other places. It suggested that this publication was propaganda cover-up of the March 20th decision of the Politburo. In Western historiography, different versions of the chronology of events have been used due to a lack of documentary sources. In particular, some works say that the method was first introduced in Siberia and then later in the Urals. Additional information became available after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, which provided greater clarity regarding the adoption of the Ural-Siberian method. Back to the text. Although the return to Civil War conditions did bring in the grain, it is worth considering the question of whether and how the grain strike might have been avoided. The evidence leads one to suspect that if Trotsky's proposals had been implemented as early as 1925 to 26, the final collapse of the Smichka and forced collectivization might not have occurred. There can be little doubt that the principal error of the party leadership was to commit excessive resources to heavy industry during the period of goods famine. This obsessive preoccupation with industrial self-sufficiency, involving the production of equipment never before manufactured in the country, at prices which, on average, were up to twice as high as foreign imports, was Stalin's contribution to Soviet policy. E.H. Carr and R.W. Davies have described its consequences. Quote, the individual peasant, having little inducement to spend, developed the traditional peasant propensity to hoard. Grain, whether as a reserve for future contingencies or as a speculation on higher prices, was the most stable and convenient form of wealth. The existence of large holdings in individual hands meant that the holders would surrender the grain only on terms, involving an adequate supply of consumer goods at acceptable prices, which were incompatible with the ever-increasing investment in heavy industry, ... End quote. E.H. Carr and R.W. Davies. Trotsky's proposals would have enabled at least a portion of the resources expended on capital-intensive projects to be used instead to purchase foreign equipment for both departments of Soviet industry. Construction costs in the Soviet Union were even higher in the 1920s, relative to pre-war prices, than manufacturing costs. Nevertheless, the Soviet government pressed ahead with prestigious projects such as the Dnieper Power Station, the Stalingrad Tractor Factory, the metallurgical works of Kryvyi and Kuznetsk, and Sverdlovsk engineering works, in every case holding the import of capital goods to a minimum. The Dnieper hydroelectric station, also known as the Dnieper Dam, is a hydroelectric power station in the city of Zaporizhzhia, Ukraine, operated by Hydroenergy. It is the fifth and largest station in the Dnieper Reservoir Cascade, a series of hydroelectric stations on the Dnieper River that supply power to the Donets, Kryvyi Rih industrial region. Its dam has a length of 800 meters, 2,600 feet, a height of 61 meters, 200 feet, and a flow rate of 38.7 meters, 127 feet per second. The dam elevates the Dnieper River by 37 meters and maintains the water level of the Dnieper Reservoir, which has a volume of 33 kilometer, the volume of 3.3 kilometers cubed. I don't know, and stretches 129 kilometers, 80 miles upstream to the nearby city of Dnipro. The reservoir has two shipping canals: the disused original one with three staircase locks, and a newer one with a staircase lock. With one staircase lock, allows ships to bypass the dam at its eastern end and sail upstream as far as the Pripyat River. A highway on the dam and bridge over the shipping canals enables vehicles to cross the Dnieper. The electrical station was built by the Soviet Union from 1927 to 1932, after being destroyed during World War II to make it harder for advancing German forces to cross the river. It was rebuilt from 1944 to 1950. An expansion built from 1969 to 1980 quadrupled the station's output, with further modernization renovations conducted in the 2000s. On the 22nd of March 2024, the Dnipro Dam was hit by Russian missiles. Power output at the Dnieper hydroelectric station came to a halt. The Volgograd tractor plant, formerly the Dzержinski tractor factory, or the Stalingrad tractor plant, is a heavy equipment factory located in Volgograd, Russia. It was once one of the largest tractor manufacturing enterprises in the USSR. It was a site of fierce fighting during World War II's Battle of Stalingrad. During its lifetime, the Volgograd tractor plant has supplied more than 2.5 million tractors to the farming industry, making a huge contribution to the mechanization of agriculture. The Volgograd tractor plant tractors operate in 32 countries throughout Southeast Asia, Africa, Europe, North America, and Latin America, also used for the production of military vehicles. VGTZ is inextricably linked with the history of Soviet tank building. The plant continues to operate on a small scale, but much of it is now derelict or has been demolished. Okay, back to the text. Up to 1/3 of all industrial investment by 1928 to 1929 were allocated to the construction of new factories rather than to the renovation of existing factories, even though new investment in Department 1, or means of production department, tended to result in new production only after a gestation period of between 3 to 5 years. The greater the resources immobilized in this way, the more difficult it became after 1925 to 1926 to regain any degree of flexibility. When the crisis reached the proportions of a disaster in 1927 to 28, a handful of Soviet officials finally awakened to the need to divert resources to the means of consumption department. By this time, it was already too late. With the campaign against Bukharin and the, quote, right danger about to begin, the inescapable reality of the situation was quietly recognized late in 1928. The share of investment allocated to the means of consumption department was again lowered. At the same time, food rationing was introduced in Leningrad. I want to read the Wikipedia for the right opposition. The right opposition in the All-Union Communist Party Bolsheviks was a label formulated by Joseph Stalin in the autumn of 1928 for the opposition against certain measures included within the first five-year plan, an opposition which was led by Nikolai Bukharin, Alexei Rykov, Mikhail Tomsky, and their supporters within the Soviet Union that did not follow the so-called, quote, general line of the party, end quote. It is also the name given to, quote, right-wing critics within the communist movement internationally, particularly those who coalesced in the international communist opposition, regardless of whether they identified with Bukharin or Rykov. The struggle for power in the Soviet Union after the death of Vladimir Lenin saw the development of three major tendencies within the Communist Party. These are described by Leon Trotsky as left, right, and center tendencies, each based on a specific caste or class. Trotsky argued that his tendency, the left opposition, represented the internationalist traditions of the working class. There's a quote here from Bukharin. It says, quote, "He is an unprincipled intriguer who subordinates everything to the preservation of his own power. He changes his theory according to whom he needs to get rid of," end quote. Bukharin on Stalin's theoretical position, 1928. The tendency led by Joseph Stalin was described as being in the center, based on the state and party bureaucracy tending to shift alliances between the left and the right. The right tendency was identified with the supporters of Nikolai Bukharin and Rykov. It was asserted that they represented the influence of the peasantry and the danger of capitalist restoration. Their policy was closely identified with the new economic policy, with former left communist Bukharin slowly moving to the right of the Bolshevik Party and becoming a strong supporter of the NEP starting in 1921. Right opposition policies encouraged kulaks and netmen to, quote, get rich, were seen by right opposition supporters as encouraging kulaks and netmen to, quote, grow into socialism. Robert J. Alexander has questioned whether the various right oppositionists could be described as a single international tendency, since they were usually concerned only with the issues relevant for their own countries and their own communist parties. Therefore, the right opposition was far more fragmented than the left opposition. Nevertheless, the various right opposition groups did come together to form an international communist opposition, ICO. Unlike the left opposition, they did not tend to form separate parties as they considered themselves loyal to the Communist International. Bracket citation needed. Stalin and his, quote, center faction were allied with Bukharin and the right opposition from late 1924, with Bukharin elaborating Stalin's theory of socialism in one country. Together, they expelled Trotsky, Kamenev, Zinoviev, and the United Opposition from the Communist Party in December 1927. However, once Trotsky was out of the way and the left opposition had been illegalized, Stalin soon became alarmed at the danger posed to the Soviet state by the rising power of the capitalistic kulaks and netmen who had become emboldened by the left opposition's illegalization. Sensing this danger, Stalin then turned on his right opposition allies. Bukharin and the right opposition were, in their turn, sidelined and removed from important positions within the Communist Party and the Soviet government from 1928 to 1930, with Stalin ending the new economic policy and beginning the first five-year plan. One of the last attempts of the rightists to resist Stalin was the Ryutin affair in 1932, where a manifesto against the Soviet policy of collectivization in Stalin was circulated. It openly called for the, quote, liquidation of the dictatorship of Stalin and his clique, end quote. Later, some rightists joined a secret bloc with Leon Trotsky, Grigory Zinoviev, and Lev Kamenev in order to oppose Stalin. Historian Pierre Bouet stated that it dissolved in early 1933. Bukharin was isolated from his allies abroad and in the face of increasing Stalinist repression was unable to mount a sustained struggle against Stalin. Unlike Trotsky, who built an anti-Stalinist movement, Bukharin and his allies capitulated to Stalin and admitted their, quote, ideological errors. They were temporarily rehabilitated, though they were allowed only minor posts and did not return to their former prominence. Bukharin and his allies were later executed during the Great Purge trials. Bracket, citation needed, end bracket. The various right oppositional groups loosely aligned with Bukharin within the Comintern were forced to form their own organizations when they were in turn purged from national sections. Where they were in turn purged from the national sections of the Comintern. In Europe, the most important and substantial of these organizations was the Communist Party Opposition, KPO, in Germany, led by Heinrich Brandler. In the United States, J. Lovestone, Bertram Wolfe, and their supporters founded the Communist Party Opposition and published the newspaper Workers' Age. In Canada, the Marxian Educational League was formed as part of Lovestone's CPO, and it became affiliated with the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation. However, by the end of 1939, both the Toronto and Montreal groups of this organization had ceased to function. In a few places, communist groups affiliated with the ICO achieved more success from the Comintern affiliated than the communist. In a few places, communist groups affiliated with the ICO achieved more success than the Comintern affiliated organizations. For example, in Sweden, the Socialist Party of Karl Kilborn and Nils Flag affiliated with the ICO and received 5.7% of the vote in the 1932 elections to the Riksdag, outpolling the Comintern section that received 3.9%. In Spain, the ICO-affiliated Bloc Obrero y Campesino, BOC, led by Joaquin Marin, was for a time larger and more important than the official Spanish Communist Party. Later, the BOC emerged with Andrés Nin's Izquierda Comunista in 1935 to form the Workers' Party of Marxist Unification, PUM, which was to be a major party backing the Second Spanish Republic in the Spanish Civil War. Marin became General Secretary of the PUM but was arrested early in the Civil War. As a result, Nin, a former Trotskyist, became the PUM's new leader. In all, the ICO had member parties in 15 countries during the 1930s. The ICO and its affiliates did not consider themselves a new international, but a, quote, faction that was involuntarily excluded from the Comintern and that was anxious to return to the Comintern if only the Comintern would change its policies and allow ICO members the freedom to advocate their positions. Despite being identified with Bukharin, the ICO generally supported Stalin's economic policies, which Bukharin opposed, citation needed, such as the 5-year plans to achieve rapid industrialization and the collectivization of agriculture. Furthermore, they even supported the early Moscow trials. Their main difference with Stalin and the Comintern was over the issue of democracy within the Comintern and the influence of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union in the Comintern and its sections, and over Stalin's international policy, particularly the Third Period and the subsequent Popular Front policies. In addition, as the Moscow trials entered their second phase and turned against Bukharin and Bukharin's supporters, disputes broke out within the ICO regarding whether there was any point in continuing with the concept of being in opposition within the communist movement rather than openly create a new international rival to the Comintern, as Trotsky did with his Fourth International. The international communist opposition began to disintegrate in 1933. With the coming to power of the Nazis, the German party had to go underground and establish an exile branch in Paris. Paris was also the new home of the international ICO headquarters, which became dominated by the Germans. The Norwegian and Swedish groups left later that year to join the new, quote, centrist International Bureau for Revolutionary Socialist Unity, or London Bureau, established in Paris that August. The Czechoslovak affiliate was weakened by the defection of its Czech members in December, making the party a largely Sudeten German group at a time when that community was becoming increasingly attracted to the Nazis. The Austrian group had to go underground after the Dollfuss Putsch of 1934, and the majority of the Alsatian section was expelled that summer for its pro-Nazi sympathies. The Swiss affiliates went over to the Social Democrats in 1936, and M.N. Roy took his Indian group out in 1937. Furthermore, the suppression of PUM in May 1937 and the execution of Bukharin and other, quote, rights in the Soviet Union had convinced many that the Communist International could not be reformed, and the idea of being a, quote, opposition within the Comintern was untenable. At a conference in February 1938, the International Communist Opposition affiliated with the London Bureau. This led to some confusion as to whether affiliates of the ICO were also affiliates of the London Bureau as organizations themselves. To straighten out this overlapping, another conference was held in Paris in April 1939, which dissolved both entities into a new organization, the International Revolutionary Marxist Center, to be headquartered in Paris. Membership in the new group was quickly ratified by the ILOA, the KPO, the PUM, the PSOP, and the Independent Labour Party, and the Archaeo-Marxists. It ceased to exist after the fall of France. A few groups continue the tradition of this current today. The Gruppe Arbeiterpolitik in Germany is one such group. The first gathering of the opposition communists was held in Berlin March 17th to 1930. It was attended by the oppositions of Germany, Czechoslovakia, Sweden, and by M.N. Roy. The meeting decided to set up an information center in Berlin to coordinate international activities and publish a bulletin, International Information of the Communist Opposition, which had previously been published by the KPO. The first official conference of the ICO was held in Berlin in December 1930. It was attended by representatives from Germany, Alsace, Sweden, the United States, Switzerland, and Norway, with letters from sympathizers in Austria, Finland, Italy, and Canada. Adopts the, quote, platform of the international communist opposition, end quote. The second official congress was held in Berlin, July 2nd to 5th, 1932, attended by representatives from Germany, Switzerland, Norway, Sweden, Spain, and the United States. A, quote, enlarged session of the Bureau, end quote, was held in July 1933 to discuss the Nazi triumph in Germany, and the Paris Conference of, quote, centrist, end quote, groups, attended by representatives from Germany, France, Switzerland, the Netherlands, and the United States. The Norwegians and Swedes did not attend as they favored participation in the Paris Conference. The ICO itself declined invitation to the conference. ICO headquarters moved to Paris. In Germany, the Gruppe Arbeiterpolitik, founded by Heinrich Brandler, is effectively a successor organization. In Austria, the Communist Opposition of Austria was established in late 1929 when the Politburo of the official Communist Party of Austria expelled Willy Schlamm, A. Reisinger, Josef Klein, and Richard Wawesny. They had their own periodical, Der Neue Mannruf, until the Dollfuss dictatorship came to power in 1934. J. Lovestone happened to be in Austria at the time of the Anschluss in early March 1938 at the invitation of a group called Der Funke, and was able to arrange 8 fake passports for 8 leaders of the Austrian opposition. They left Vienna on the 14th of March, the day before Hitler arrived in the city. Willy Schlamm later edited a paper for Austrian exiles in Prague, Weltbühne, then emigrated to the United States. In Hungary, an opposition group was established in 1932. At that time, the Hungarian Communist Party was already an underground movement, and the opposition claimed about 10% of its membership. In Poland, while never a formal organization, there was a tendency within the Polish Communist Party, usually known as the, quote, 3 Ws, after the leaders Adolf Warski, Henryk Waleski, and Maria Kosciuszka. Pseudonym Vera Kostrzeva. As the party was already underground in Poland and the communists already weak, the group decided not to create a formal organization, though they were often depicted as followers of Brandler and Thalheimer by the leadership. All 3 died in gulags. In Switzerland, the official Communist Party leader, Jules Humbert Droz, was sympathetic to the right opposition and because of that lost his powerful position in the Comintern. Later, Jules Humbert Droz self-criticized and capitulated to the communist leadership, only to be expelled in 1943. One cantonal section of the Swiss Communist Party in Schaffhausen did secede from a communist opposition group. For a while it was quite successful, dominating the local labor movement, especially among tool and watchmakers. On the 20th of October 1933 elections, in the 20th of October 1933 elections, the CPO elected 10 of the 30 local councillors, and CPO leader Walter Bringhoff was chosen as mayor. By 1936, the CPO had merged with the Swiss Socialist Party. There was some resistance in the Italian party to the new third period line. At first, the 2 Italian ECCI members, Palmiro Tagliati and Angelo Tosca, opposed the Comintern's actions with regard to the German party. However, at the 10th plenum in June 1929, Tagliati capitulated to Stalin's wishes, while Tosca was expelled. Later, at a May 1930 plenum of the party, Politburo members Pasquini and Santini were removed for opposing the third period, and, quote, organizational measures, end quote, were taken against lower cadres. In Denmark, a Danish opposition group was founded in 1933. It lasted at least until February 1938, when its representative attended the ICO Unity Conference with the London Bureau. In France, the initial purge of the Communist Party in 1929 took mayors or city councillors from Clichy, Alphée, Saint-Denis, Pierrefitte-sur-Seine, Vientiane, and Paris. The party's general secretary and the editor of La Humanité were also demoted. However, not all the expelled necessarily adhered to the ICO's positions. The Parisian councillors, for instance, formed their own party, Workers' and Peasants' Party, which in turn joined the Party of Proletarian Unity in December 1930. The small national opposition group joined the expelled Seine Federation of the SFIO in 1938 to form the Workers' and Peasants' Socialist Party. A separate ICO party, the Opposition of Communist Party of Alsace-Lorraine, KPO, was created in Alsace. The Alsatian KPO campaigned for autonomy for Alsace and formed an alliance with clerical autonomists. The Alsatian KPO was led by Charles Huber, mayor of Strasbourg, who lived from 1929 to 1935, and Jean-Pierre Mourer, member of the French National Assembly. It ran a daily newspaper of its own, Die Neue Welt. The Alsatian KPO gradually moved towards pro-Nazi positions and were expelled from the ICO in 1934. A small group remained loyal to the ICO and published a weekly Arbeiterpolitik, but had little influence. During most of its history, the right opposition in the United Kingdom was represented principally within the Independent Labour Party. Oppositionists joined the Revolutionary Policy Committee, part of which represented their line within the ILP. An independent opposition group was formed in 1935 but had little influence. By 1938, the line of the ICO had turned towards the, quote, centrist position of the Independent Labour Party leadership under Fenner Brockway, and the work of independent factions within the party became less tenable. The leading Indian communist, M.N. Roy, was an early and outspoken supporter of the right opposition. While he never had more than a marginal following, he wielded extraordinary influence on the left wing of the Indian National Conference and played an instrumental role in the election of Subhas Chandra Bose to the leadership of Congress. However, after Bose split with the Congress and formed the All India Forward Bloc, Roy sharply diverged to the point where he even came to oppose the Congress-led Quit India campaign. The split between Bose and Roy was in many ways analogous to the American split between Bertram Wolfe and Jay Lovestone. While never an official member of the ICO, a right opposition led by José Penelon split from the Communist Party of Argentina in 1928. Penelon's group formed the Partido Comunista de Región Argentina, the Communist Party of the Argentine region, which was later renamed the Partido Concentración Obrera, Labor Gathering Party. It merged with the Social Democrats in 1971. The Marxist Workers' Bloc of Mexico was founded in early 1937. It published a few issues of a newspaper called La Batalla after the Pums Journal and announced its adherence to the ICO. It was never heard from again. Okay, so back to the text. It is true that the implementation of Trotsky's approach would have brought difficulties with the onset of the Great Depression in 1929 to 1930. To continue a high degree of import dependency would have been costly when the terms of world trade turned sharply against primary producers. All the same, it is difficult to imagine that the resulting dislocations of the Soviet economy would have been remotely comparable to those which issued from forced collectivization. Moreover, By the time these difficulties materialized, light industry might well have developed to the point where a dynamic internal balance could have been maintained, involving a gradual transition towards the expansion of domestic heavy industry. Textile factories, commissioned in 1925 to 26, would have been built and producing by 1928 to 1929, when Trotsky began his years of exile. It was in the exile period that Trotsky undertook his final assessment of Soviet agricultural policy, beginning with a paper written in November 1928 entitled, "What is the Smitchka?" Here Trotsky wrote, quote, "Even a genuinely established smitchka between industry and peasant agriculture represents not a basis for a future National Socialist economy, but only a proper stable relationship between the proletariat and the peasantry of a separate country during the time of the, quote, breathing space. That is, until a war or until a revolution in other countries. A victory of the proletariat in the leading countries would signify for us a radical construction of the economic base in accordance with a more productive international division of labor, which alone can create a real foundation for a socialist society." End quote. The theory of socialism in one country, he reasoned, had grown out of a false understanding of the Smitchka. Bukharin had initiated the confusion with his vision of diminishing class struggle. Quote, "Even a theoretical analysis should have indicated that the coexistence of two systems, the capitalist and the socialist, struggling with each other and at the same time providing each other with sustenance, must from time to time cause unusually acute crises." End quote. Misled by an ideal of social harmony, by, quote, "theoretical scholasticism," and, quote, "practical short-sightedness," end quote, Bukharin had pressed for the administrative lowering of prices in 1926 to 27, which brought on the, quote, grain strike. Before the crisis could be mitigated, it would be necessary to close the price scissors and restore first the pre-war terms of trade and eventually those prevailing in the world market. The perpetuation of the price scissors, Trotsky continued, served as a constant reminder to the peasants that socialist industry had failed to demonstrate its superiority over capitalism. It was understandable, therefore, why the peasant should differentiate between the democratic Bolshevik, who had given him land, from the communists, and the communist, who had wished to take it away. Until this dichotomy was erased from the peasant's mind, the danger of counter-revolution would fester and grow. By the time Trotsky recorded these thoughts, Stalin had already condoned the preservation of the scissors as an object of policy. In the spring of 1930, the 16th Party Congress dismissed concern over the scissors as a, quote, bourgeois prejudice. Trotsky responded in the bulletin to the left opposition, forecasting that Stalin's ultra-left bureaucratic adventure would end in panic and retreat, on the assumption that income within the kolkhozy would be distributed in a truly cooperative manner, that is, in accordance with the share of the productive forces contributed by each peasant. He concluded that the kulak would necessarily re-emerge within the collective farm. An entire social class would only be, quote, eliminated by a change in technology and in the mode of production, not by administrative methods. It is no more possible to create large-scale mechanized agriculture out of wooden plows and kulak horses than it was to create a ship by adding up fishing boats. All-round collectivization would destroy incentives and lead to, quote, all-round weeds in the fields, end quote. Paraphrasing Bukharin, Trotsky wrote that, quote, "It is impossible to build kolkhozy today without tractors of the future," end quote. Trotsky. The reactionary utopia of a socialist Atlantis had given rise to, quote, something in Russian. Now it was necessary to, quote, repudiate the, quote, ideals, end quote, of a shut-in economy, end quote, and work out a new variant of the plan involving the quote, broadest possible interaction with the world market, end quote. As Trotsky groped for a way out of the impasse, Stalin promised a meeting of collective farm shock workers in February 1933 that the goal of Soviet policy was, quote, to make all the collective farmers prosperous. Wikipedia says the udarnik, also known in English as a shock worker or strike worker, collectively known as shock brigades or shock labor team, is a high productivity worker derived from the expression of, quote, udarni trud, quote, end quote, for, quote, super productive enthusiastic labor, end quote. In the Soviet Union, the term was linked to the shock worker of communist labor, a Soviet honorary title, as well as Alexei Stakhanov and the movement named after Alexei Stakhanov. However, the terminology of shock workers has also been used in other socialist states, most notably in the People's Republic of China, North Korea, the People's Republic of Bulgaria, and the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. Soviet shock workers are not always necessarily citizens of the USSR. As one British communist and trade union leader, Jesse Eden, was elected when at the Stalin automotive plant, later renamed the ZIL Automotives. The hope behind promoting shock labor was that through socialist emulation, the rest of the workforce would learn from the vanguard. The Soviet Union promoted shock work during the first 5-year plan period in an effort to increase productivity through human effort in the absence of more developed machinery. Cultural theorist Susan Buck-Morss contrasts shock work's stimulation of productivity in rushes of labor with the standardization of Taylorism. In People's Republic of Poland, a similar title was something in Polish translated as model worker, a calque from another Soviet Russian term, literally, quote, leader in production, end quote. Seen as the Polish version of the Stakhanovite movement, famous Polish workers given the title of leader in production included Piotr Lazansky and especially the, quote, Polish Stakhanov, Wincenty Piotrowski, a miner who in 1947 achieved 270% expected efficiency per month. Later, Piotrowski died due to misconducted dental intervention, but in official propaganda it was due to deadly exhaustion. In the Czechoslovak Socialist Republic, an udarnik was titled udernik, which with slightly different pronunciation in the Czech and Slovak languages. Underníci were elite workers who surpassed their work quotas and were used by the party as propaganda. This breaking of production quotas, while usually real and often reaching astounding heights of the order of several 100%, was achieved at the cost of substandard quality, lack of work safety regulations, and lack of concern for personal health. Most importantly, udarnici usually did not perform any minor tasks mandated by the job standards they were supposed to follow. These tasks were performed by other workers, yet this work counted towards the udarnik's quota. Bracket, citation needed, end bracket. Back to the text. As Trotsky groped for a way out of the impasse, Stalin promised a meeting of collective farm shock workers in February 1933 that the goal of Soviet policy was, quote, to make all the collective farmers prosperous, end quote. In reality, the contradiction between the form and content of the kolkhozy was about to take its dreadful toll. Khrushchev described this period in his memoirs. Khrushchev tells of a train which pulled into Kiev loaded with corpses, quote, it had picked up corpses all the way from Poltava to Kiev, end quote. An estimated 5 to 10 million people died in the famine, but no mention of the disaster appeared in the Soviet press. How terrible it was, commented Nikita Khrushchev, was that no one told Stalin. Stalin could not possibly have known what was happening, for he had recently assured the shock workers that, quote, no less than 20 million of the peasant population, no less than 20 million poor peasants have been rescued from destitution and ruin, have been rescued from kulak bondage, and attained material security thanks to the collective farms. End quote. Stalin. This brief survey indicates that a clear theme prevailed in all of Trotsky's writings on Soviet agriculture, a theme which distinguished his views from those of most contemporaries. Economic development, Trotsky argued, was invariably constrained by objectivity and cannot be subjectively manipulated. The purpose of economic planning was to exercise foresight in the presence of, and not apart from, objective economic laws. To achieve their ends, the planners must seek to transform the material forces of production. Marx has shown that each mode of production embraces a unique combination of productive forces and productive relations. More consistently than either Stalin or Bukharin, Trotsky's principal adversaries, Trotsky believed that one could not change in isolation from the other. Thank you so much for listening.